Hi, and welcome to this preview video of lines 1632 to 1913 of Maria Headley's translation of Beowulf. This is a section of the poem that if you were going through this poem really quickly, you'd skim over. The plot of it is not surprising and perhaps not even that interesting. I think the details, the tone, imagery, and many surprises that lurk here reward a close reading. So, as always, when reading great books, I just encourage you to move more deliberately when you're tempted to skim. But the plot is pretty straightforward. The plot is Beowulf bidding farewell to Hrothgar and the Danes to return back home to Geatland. It might be worth doing in a journal, in your book, or in conversation to write down or say what your predictions are. How will Hrothgar behave during this farewell? How will Beowulf behave? What will they ask of each other? What will they promise each other? What will the tone be? Anything negative, mostly positive. So just some things to think about. Regardless of whether you end up being right, it's often really interesting to see if your predictions come true. The poem I start class with in the beginning of this class is Ted Kooser, one of my favorite poets, his poem about depression glass, and it's actually largely a poem about heirlooms and old things, and I just thought it was fitting for this section of the poem where Beowulf is given more gifts to bring home. So if you go to 1645, actually, it's pretty much page 70, 72 and 73. I would just write in the margins of those pages the word tone, T-O-N-E, because the plot is relatively straightforward. In the second stanza on page 72, it says on line 1645, that leader of men entered the hall a hero. This is Beowulf returning from Grendel's mother's defeat. Made his way to Hrothgar, grit written. Beowulf's crew dragged Grendel's head into the mead hall. This is a larger than average head, right? The head of a giant, where a meal was being served, and a host of lesser men ferried cups to mouths. In their midst was the queen of the house. There hoard their treasure. The Danes stared, jaws dropped. Talk about an entrance, right? I tell my seniors, you want to make an impression in the dorm, get your guys to drag a giant head, dismembered head into the room. That you'll definitely get attention. You'll probably get written up and maybe expelled too. And the narrator says in the next line, Beowulf made a speech to end all speeches, that son of Ecgtheow. Again, I say this to my students, whenever a teacher of any subject reads from the text out loud, mark it. And I tell my students, write R.A., read aloud in the margin. He basically goes through his narration of the second battle. It's really interesting. There's several moments in Beowulf where we get two different versions of the same story. Pay attention, starting in 1652, what the differences and similarities are between Beowulf's version of Beowulf's story and the poet's version of Beowulf's story. And so I just think that's really interesting. Also, there's more slang used here. Pay attention to tone. Then, line 1687, so the top of page 74, says, Hrothgar considered his convictions. He handled the hilt. Beowulf had given Hrothgar the giant hilt of the sword he used to kill Grendel's mother. He handled the hilt, an ancient thing, a fossil from forgotten days, squinting at the legend left there for the literate. It was engraved with an epic inscrutable to him, the story of how war woke in the world, and a flood brewed, drowning the race of giants, placing them beneath the waves, a punishment for others, poor, lord-lacking unbelievers, sin-soaked strangers severed from sanctuary. So first, think of how big the hilt would have to be to tell the story of a chunk of the Old Testament. How war woke in the world, maybe Cain and Abel, and Noah's flood, and how the sinful were all slaughtered, including the race of giants. Lots of questions lurk here for me. If the race of giants are killed off, where do the Grendels come from? who are from the race of giants. That's interesting. But it says the race of giants are placed beneath the waves, a punishment for others, poor Lord lacking unbelievers. So maybe they're underwater giants now. I don't know. But I guess maybe the 20,000 foot question is, why is it interesting or important to mention that this is the story told on Grendel's mother's sword? The story of how war started in the world and of the flood, of Noah's flood. Something to think about. I haven't seen lots of people write about this. I'd be curious to hear in the comments what we think the significance of that is. Think of all the creative possibilities. What could have been on Grendel's mother's sword? Which stories? And why Noah's flood being the prominent one? Then there's a moment starting in 1724, and I just write in the margins with an arrow going down, Hrothgar's homily, which is what this speech is known. Most people that read this poem are seniors in high school. My students who are studying British literature are seniors. And I tell them, older people always love giving you life advice because they don't think you know anything. But definitely before going to college, they'll sit you down and give you life advice. And depending on the relative, the life advice will be different, whether it's how to behave socially, how to carry yourself, what classes to take, what to major in, how to make friends, how to get a good job. Lots of opinions on this. This is sort of dad speak in a lot of ways. Really, really interesting. And I would just encourage you, think about what Beowulf's done for Hrothgar. And Hrothgar dispenses sort of a fatherly advice. And the center of it is this. It's the very bottom of page 76. I just need you to mark this. Line 1758. Hrothgar says to Beowulf, arm yourself against that kind of idiocy, my brave boy, my Beowulf. Keep yourself on an even keel, aiming your ambition at eternity instead of the everyday. Don't let avarice, greed, right, override intelligence. It's only a season that a young soldier's strength stays stalwart before plague or blade bring obsolescence. A crackling blaze, a rush of waves, a slippery sword grip, a spear soaring silently through the air, or even the ague of age. Your gaze will darken too, boy. Your world will dim. Death will keel you over eventually and solicit your surrender. It's a very blunt reminder to Beowulf about the inevitability of death and the fact that everything is fleeting. I just ask you to think about, and if you're in my class, we'll talk about this. Considering the amazing things Beowulf has just done for Hrothgar, what do you make of the fact that this is Hrothgar's last speech to him? And then just a little fun tidbit, if you have a loose definition of fun, is the fact that Hrothgar's homily is largely taken from a really important work of philosophy by someone called Boethius, who in 524 was imprisoned for a year unjustly. He was an influential person in the empire, in Roman Empire, and he was imprisoned unjustly and eventually executed. And he wrote, while unjustly in prison, this beautiful dialogue with Lady Philosophy, and it's called The Consolation of Philosophy, in which his thesis is, do not put faith in mutable goods. In other words, do not put faith in mutable goods, things that change, the stuff of everyday life. Don't wake up and only care about what you wear and your status and stuff like that. It's sort of a later version of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. It reminds me a lot of that, which is also really worth reading. I mention this because, as a side note, the whole focus on the fleetingness of everyday life is a real core component in English history, actually. In the 9th century, King Alfred was the first to translate Boethius, which is in Latin, into Anglo-Saxon. In the 13th century, Geoffrey Chaucer, the great poet of the later Middle Ages, translated Boethius into Middle English. And in the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth herself translated Boethius into modern English. So Boethius's focus on paying attention to the eternal and the unchangeable is almost like a chorus throughout English history. And it's definitely a chorus throughout the world of Anglo-Saxon poetry, a world where things of this world can be taken from you just in an instant. And I'm speaking this video right now as Afghanistan is in a terrible amount of turmoil, and you don't have to go that far to reach turmoil. Not far from me, there's a lot of motels on a highway where the transient population of Boston is put. And I know for a fact that some of those people were doing really well a year ago, and they're not now. And the things of this world have all disappeared. And I bet if they were to read Boethius, they would feel it more deeply than I would. So I just think it's interesting to know like the intellectual underpinnings of where Hrothgar is coming from. But I'm not like covering or fully explaining the speech. I'm just pointing out that this idea to pay attention to the eternal and not the material, not the stuff of the world, is just a constant in this kind of poetry. So to me, the next question is why? Why would that be the philosophical idea that they're fixated on? So if you go to line 1841, they have an emotional farewell together. Hrothgar is extremely emotionally open. I tell my students that there really are no private thoughts, really, until Shakespeare in English literature. We don't have, soliloquies in Beowulf. Every moment is incredibly public. So for Hrothgar to be this emotionally open, that's 1841 to 1887. So you can just go down page 81 and just put like Hrothgar's farewell. And it's, my daughter's about to go to college, and I look at the bottom of page 81. He opened his arms. He let him go. It's the essence of farewell, an open-armed embrace and a letting go. It's a really human moment, right, between two kind of superhuman characters. And in 1885, Beowulf's men, as they leave, say that was a good king. And again, we can't get rid of this idea that no matter what his people went through before Beowulf showed up, Hrothgar is a good king. And it might be worth talking about arguments for and against Hrothgar being a good king. The definition of a good king was set early in the poem, on the first page. But I think like a lot of things in really complicated books, definitions evolve within the books themselves. It'd be interesting to think about right now is, what is a good king right now in Beowulf? Early on, it's keeping your enemies at bay and giving gifts. Well, Hrothgar does one of those things. He needs help with the other one. Possibly, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, that maybe right now the poem believes that part of what's a good king is an emotional openness. I don't know if that's true, but it's definitely a new element of kingly behavior that we just saw. So it's just interesting to think about. I always want to acknowledge the fact that in these videos and in my teaching, I'm noticing probably 1% of all the possible observations and thoughts on any of these things. So a lot of times on the quizzes I give my students, which are writing based, one of the questions is, tell me something you noticed. And invariably I learn a lot. So what do you notice? What stands out to you? Whether I mentioned it or if it's totally different. What stands out to you in these final interactions between Beowulf and Hrothgar? I hope these observations helped. Good luck with your reading and stay in touch.